I'll invite people if you have questions. I see Seth is shepherding them over here. I have a few also coming in from email. So one general question is about progression-free survival versus overall survival, and just open it up to general discussion. I would say that historically, overall survival has been our big gold standard, but Gideon, you mentioned that especially when you have highly efficacious agents in a randomized trial, it's kind of ethically appropriate, if not a mandate, to cross over, but that messes up the overall survival result. To me, this would suggest that PFS, progression-free survival, matters a lot more. Any comments about that endpoint versus response rate, or as relatively valuable or less so, especially in an era where, in addition to these highly efficacious agents that patients can come off and onto, we have immunotherapies that may muddy the water on response rate but lead to long periods of benefit?
Yeah, so as you point out, the gold standard endpoint of overall survival becomes challenging when when you become sort of victims of your own success. Patients are living longer. We have more active therapies to go on. So it's by no means a bad thing to rethink some of the endpoints. We hear these debates often, both internally as well as externally. Is progression-free survival, is that a direct clinical benefit in and of itself, or is it a surrogate for overall survival? And not only in lung cancer, but in other diseases like kidney cancer, melanoma, we've accepted large magnitudes of progression-free survival with, favorable risk-benefit for a regular approval. And, that can be a benefit in and of itself, delaying the progression as long as the therapy is very well tolerated. Overall survival is a lot easier to measure, obviously. With respect to immunotherapy, I think that's very early on. How often do these atypical responses, these pseudo-progressions occur? And I think we're going to have randomized phase 3 data to look at very soon to get a better handle on what are the optimal endpoints for immunotherapy.
Mm-hmm. One person had asked about, well, why would a patient want to accept greater toxicity of something like adding Avastin for a progression-free survival benefit if you don't get an overall survival benefit? And I would point out, and welcome your comments if you want to add, either of you, that not showing an overall survival benefit doesn't mean there isn't one. It's just that we don't know. And when you have patients crossing over, it could just be that both sides end up getting the benefit. We don't know if earlier is way better than later. One person had asked about, well, what about adding Avastin to patients who either have demonstrated some progression, maybe it's slow progression, or if they've been on it for 3 months are doing well, and then we get these new data. We don't know that, but so I think the main point about overall survival to me is that it's incredibly difficult to assess, especially in patients who are fortunate enough to now be living years with these therapies. The component that is from just one part of treatment, their first line treatment versus the 4 or more that might follow.
Yeah, I completely agree. We're living in an era now where many of our approved therapies, whether it be olatinib or crizotinib, are approved based on progression-free survival benefits that because the drugs are now available, it may be difficult to ever show whether they truly improve survival. Although, when you do get the opportunity to see that, and I think there was a combined analysis of afatinib trials in EGFR mutant patients that was presented at this year's ASCO that did actually show a survival benefit to first-line afatinib versus chemotherapy. And when they got a large enough pool of patients and they were able to follow them over a longer period of time, I'm still not entirely convinced that that's necessarily an afatinib-specific effect or maybe the fact that there was an unusually large number of patients on the trial who were never able to cross over from chemotherapy onto a TKI. So that doesn't mean that it's not I think what that did, though, is it proved that being on a TKI does improve survival. And that's something that is difficult to show in a randomized trial. And in terms of adding Avastin, you know, I would hope that if you see a magnitude of benefit that large, you would see some survival benefit before you would start routinely adding something to the TKI.
But that's where the judgment, you know, Geeden made the point, look, if you're assessing progression-free survival and the difference is 6 or 9 or 12 months or longer, that is very substantial. That's a different kind of debate than we would have in a prior era where overall survival is the clear gold standard because the PFS difference is 5, 6, 7 weeks. We're talking about really a different magnitude of benefit when you're talking months or many months or longer, and that's I think a very reasonable judgment.
Yeah, one thing I would want to add is overall survival is a more reproducible endpoint. So if you do see a big effect on progression-free survival, you would want to make sure that the study is adequate and well controlled, conducted in a very rigorous manner, because if it's a very big effect, there might not be as many biases. But you do want to be careful that you're not overestimating.
Well, one issue is progression-free survival you can only get when you look for it, and you know, overall survival is really a not debatable point. Another question that comes up, I know you have a clear answer to it, but is worth pointing out, is to the question of FDA, can you regulate the cost of a drug, and what do you do about the cost of anti-cancer drugs?
That's an easy one, no. No, we can't regulate the cost. That's not in our purview. I mean, as a citizen, as a physician, obviously we're all very concerned about the rising costs, but you know, FDA alone, I don't think has that authority to tackle that problem.
And you guys are pretty much blind to that issue when making your decisions. Okay. Also, questions about Nate. You had mentioned TS, thymidylate synthase, and someone had asked about, well, what is the role of ex vivo sensitivity testing today? Are you doing specifically thymidylate synthase? Do you do any panels? What is the role of panels like Rational Therapeutics or various other ones for saying this regimen is a good choice and that one isn't?
So in terms of, so I don't routinely use these panels in judging patients. Part of the reason for that is that you have to make a judgment on whether to treat a patient in a relatively short period of time. I do think that some of these patient-derived xenograft models, where you're actually taking the cancer cells out, growing them either in a dish or in a mouse, and then following along and being able to test what works and what doesn't work, sounds like a great idea and actually has some pretty good evidence that it may even be beneficial. But I don't know that people realize that it can take 6 months or longer before you actually get enough of a tumor there that you can test it. And so it's not something that right now is really available for routine use in lung cancer patients. And of course, I think people would consider about a 2/3 accept rate a pretty good one. So 1 in 3 patients, it wouldn't even work. As far as upfront testing for TS, there are commercial panels that do test for that. I don't think that it's yet useful enough to be using, to deny someone pemetrexed, for example, because it seems like their TS levels are a little too high based on an assay. The level of evidence just isn't that good right now.
But I think it was a very useful proof of principle just to the one gentleman who was married to say, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, that chemotherapy is not of negligible value, even though it's less sexy than the latest targeted therapy or immunotherapy, that these are still treatments that have demonstrated benefit in hundreds of thousands of patients already and have moved the bar to get us here. And in some patients can be very substantial. In fact, in the IPASS study, one interesting thing that was noted, that was one that Jared Weiss, I believe, pointed out, that the response rate in EGFR mutation positive patients to the same standard chemotherapy given whether you were mutant or not was twice as high in patients with an EGFR mutation. I don't think we see quite that difference in routine practice as a response rate of 50–60%, but it certainly suggests that this is not just a terrible consolation prize to patients.
No, and you don't know whether that is also that a lot of EGFR mutation positive patients tend to be younger, tend to be healthier, maybe people you would expect to have a better prognosis to begin with. But it's certainly been my experience that many of my EGFR mutation positive patients do very well and much longer than I would expect on average with chemotherapy.
Several people have asked both a few questions that came in on the note cards here, a couple of folks online about compassionate use programs and what FDA's role is in that, or how sites are chosen, or what's that process, if either of you can speak to it, or both.
Yeah, I can jump in first. One of the myths that I'd like to dispel actually is that a sponsor wanted to give a patient a drug in a compassionate use program, and the FDA rejected that application or IND. That's virtually never happens. The process of compassionate use is the patient and the physician have to go to the drug company to get the drug. And if the drug company gives permission, typically the FDA, in virtually all cases, approves that compassionate use. A lot of times, as I mentioned during my talk, for breakthrough therapies, sometimes the sponsors don't have enough material, so they'll run into problems with ramping up the manufacturing, so that might be an issue on the sponsor's side. But we, Rick Pazder, my boss, has said he's wanted to initiate this program at ASCO, where any time sort of a pivotal study is announced, that the applicant would also announce what their plans are for compassionate use, because it's analogous to holding a glass of water to a patient, to a thirsty patient in the desert. I mean, it's really critical that in that time between ramping up the manufacturing, getting that application to the FDA, and the review time, that drugs can be made available to patients.
I would, in addition to compassionate use programs, there's the emergency IND program, so individual patient INDs for drugs.
Can you specify?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. It's a something new drug, investigational new drug. I know it was something new drug. It's basically something that you have to file with the FDA when you want to do a trial to lead a drug to approval. And an individual or emergency IND is a situation where you have a patient who doesn't fit onto a trial but still might benefit from a drug. And if you get permission from the company and permission from the FDA and permission from your IRB, you can actually get this drug for the patient, essentially run a clinical trial with an N of 1 on your patient. And it's a pain in the butt, but I've done it before, and I have a great example of a patient who went on crizotinib on an emergency IND because he didn't qualify for the trial and is still alive. It's now 4 years later. On the other hand, there are good reasons for companies not to do this because they don't want to mess up their regulatory process, and that's part of the reason they have such tight controls of the inclusion and exclusion criteria, is they don't want to suddenly have very ill patients dying, maybe for reasons other than their drug, and that may interrupt the approval process so that larger numbers of patients can get exposure to these drugs. So recently I inquired about another emergency IND of a company that I won't name, who turned me down and said, no, we're just not accepting any applications for this, and I understand that rationale.
Right. I mean, there is an issue. We've seen with Avastin, for instance, that it's a very helpful drug in some patients, but there are risks if it's given to too broad a population, and if Avastin had been given too broadly, it might have been not available to people with lung cancer and just known as the drug that makes you cough up blood and die. And so, I mean, I think if it were given indiscriminately, I think that's one of the fears. Mm-hmm. But, compassionate use, you mentioned the regulatory steps. It sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but it's all extremely expedited in these settings.
It took like 48 hours to get the patient
amazingly fast,
access to
considering
the drugs, yeah. I didn't do anything else for that 48 hours, but yes.
But I think, and that's part of the issue. People say, well, how can we get this? Well, the problem is not every not every practice is equipped with the manpower to do that, and that's just the reality. People, several other questions people had were about, can I do chemotherapy or can I do X or Y second-line EGFR inhibitor and then do a trial? It's important to clarify, just as a general principle, clinical trials have different requirements. There are some that are for just first-line previously untreated patients. There's some that are specifically for patients who have gotten Iressa or Tarceva or crizotinib and nothing else. And there's others that are for patients who may have gotten chemotherapy 1 line or 3 lines or no limit if your performance status is good enough. Every clinical trial has its own set of parameters, the eligibility requirements, and it's a checklist, but they can be very liberal or very restrictive. When they're restrictive, it's really not meant to be a punishment as much as to ensure that we're comparing apples to apples and that it's not such a heterogeneous population that we're missing a real benefit because we're treating so many patients with such a varied level of performance status and prior treatment and resistance that we're missing a potentially effective therapy because it's just too broad. So thank you both very much. I'm sorry if we didn't get to everyone's questions. Again, just a lot of good questions came in.